Good afternoon. Thank you for joining the Kansas Board of Regents Kansas Promise Scholarship Act webinar. Today, we will go over some of the information that we have at this moment for the Kansas Promise Act. Today, we would like for each of you to please submit all of your questions that you may have through the question and answer feature at the bottom of your screen. If you're not able to see it right now with us sharing our screen, all you have to do is move your mouse a little bit and the features will appear. KBOR will gather all of those questions that we received today, and we will be developing an FAQ that will be posted to our specific Kansas Promise Scholarship Act website that we have. And with that, I will turn it over to Scott.
Thank you, Katie. Actually, this is Elaine Frisbee, Vice President for Finance and Administration. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope I'm coming through loud and clear. Welcome to the webinar. So today we're here to talk about House Bill 2064, the Kansas Promise Act. This legislation is more than a year in the making and was signed into law on April 23rd of this year. It does not take effect until July 1. With regards to this bill, we have heard a lot about what was intended to be done in the administration of this bill. As a state agency bound by the laws enacted by the legislature, whether it was intended or not, the Board of Regents will administer the act in accordance with the language of the bill. Our work today, our webinar, will be focused on the language of the bill. We do not have authority to do anything outside the scope of that bill. So this program, being unlike any other financial aid program the Kansas Board of Regents administers, this will take a team effort across our agency and all of the institutions of higher ed with eligible programs to get this launched. The legislature put in place several standards that must be met by students to avoid repayment of their scholarship. We will go over those today, and we will work with the institutions to make sure that everyone understands how the program works. And we will ultimately get what everybody wants, a better trained workforce and better job opportunities for Kansans. We'll go to the next slide. The Board of Regents was appropriated $10 million for Promise Act scholarships. Our agency is the one responsible for managing this brand new program. Again, our goal is to make this as easy to administer as possible, given the requirements of the legislation. For distributing the $10 million, our plan, as we know it now, is to distribute a full year's allocation to the institutions so you can manage your share of the total. Because this is so new, we are still working out the details. As soon as we have identified amounts for each institution, that will be communicated so you know what you'll be working with. Working from this clean slate, we're going to examine credit hour production in the fields of study identified in the legislation and in the alternative programs identified, and then apportion funding according to credit hour production. How the funding will be distributed in the second year and beyond is subject to change as we learn more about student awards. You can go to the next slide for the next person. Julene, are you muted? All right, well, we'll check on Julene. We may be having a technical difficulty.
Julene's unmuted. I'm not sure what's. What's going on?
Well, we've got IT on it now, so we'll find out. What I believe she wanted to reference on this slide, though, this is still Elaine Frisbee, is that House Bill 2064 is available, of course, on the legislative website. And she gives you the URL to find that website on the legislative website. There is also a nice legislative staff summary of the bill. But honestly, the text of the bill, being as short as it is a quite easy read and 4 pages long. So I would encourage anyone to go and seek out that bill and have it in hand. If you're going to be involved in administering it and advising students in any way, I would encourage you to make sure you're familiar with the provisions of the legislation and be ready to go.
Can
you hear? Now there's Jillian.
There I am. I can't get the video yet, but I've got the audio. So
okay, very good.
Elaine, for taking that slide. I did want to give some people a little minute to jot down that website if they wanted to anyway. So if you want to follow along, we are actually going to walk through pretty much in the order that the provisions are in the Act. We will be sharing a copy of it on the screen for you as well. So whichever works best for you, feel free to do that. The citation to the Act until it's published in the 2021 session laws is 2021 House Bill number 2064. And a link to where it can be found on the legislature's website was what you had on the prior screen. In this slide, this shows you section 1A, which provides the name of the act. The Kansas Promise Scholarship Act is its official designation. Section 1B provides definitions for key terms in the act. So according to the statutory provisions, eligible institutions are the community colleges, the technical colleges, and the private independent institutions that offer any Promise eligible program. The definition for service member, it points to another statute, 48-3406, and that statute defines military service member as any member of the Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force, Air or Army National Guard of any state, Coast Guard, or any branch of the military reserves. Part-time student is defined as a student who is enrolled for 6 credit hours or more in a semester, but who is not enrolled as a full-time student. There isn't a definition for full-time student in the bill, so that's a term that we may need to define in the regulations. Promise eligible program then is the final definition given in the Act, and it's defined as any 2-year associate degree program or career and technical education certificate or standalone program offered by an eligible institution that is identified as a Promise eligible program by the Board of Regents. What can constitute a Promise eligible program is further restricted by the provisions of sections 2C and 3, which Scott Smathers will talk about more when we get to those sections in the webinar. Section 2A, so you can advance this slide, please, creates the Kansas Promise Scholarship Program and charges the Board of Regents with administering the program. And then section 2B authorizes the board to adopt rules and regulations and gives the board until March 1st, 2022 to do that. Because we want to start the program sooner than that and provide for these scholarships earlier than when we can get regulations in place, we will have a funds disbursement agreement with each institution for the fall 21 and spring 22 semesters. And it will be that agreement that will establish the items listed in this subsection of the bill. We hope to have a draft agreement out for review by the institutions by June 1st or sooner. In the meantime, we will also begin drafting regulations and we'll get those out to the institutions as we can to solicit feedback. I anticipate the institutions having at least 2 to 3 touch points on those regulations as they progress through the statutory rules and regulations filing act process. That's a really lengthy process. So when I say we won't have them in place in time, I mean, it's been taking us 9 to 12 months to do permanent regulations, and it's probably at least 6 months to do even a temporary regulation. There's so many steps to jump through in the Rule and Regulation Filing Act process. But we will work to have at least temporary regulations in place by the March 1st, 2022 deadline. If you can advance the slide, and I think it's Scott now.
Well, good afternoon. For those of you that don't know me, my name's Scott Smathers, and I'm the VP of Workforce Development for the Board of Regents. I'm also joined by April Henry, who's Director of Workforce, and who many of you have worked with previously, I know. We're going to discuss the board's responsibility in identifying the promise eligible programs within the Promise Act. But before we get started, we want to take a moment to thank all of the institutions for your work in helping us in this effort. I know it's involved a fair bit of time and effort on your part, and we really do appreciate it. So with that said, I'll get started. As you're aware, for the Promise Act, we first identified technical programs for each institution that fell within the 4 approved identified fields of study, which were information technology and security, mental and physical health care, advanced manufacturing and building trades, or early childhood education and development. We then sent the colleges a spreadsheet of this information and asked them to review the technical programs that we identified and let us know if there were other technical programs that they currently offered in these fields of study that they felt should be included. In addition, we asked the colleges to provide us with copies of 2+2 or articulation agreements for any transfer programs that once again related to these 4 fields of study. We received the information back and have now provided a final version to the institutions for their records, as well as to give them one last opportunity to review what has been submitted. I should point out that for private institutions, the effort I've described has been coordinated through Matt Lindsay, and pretty much going forward as well has been coordinated by Matt Lindsay, and we greatly appreciate his help in this effort. Okay, so jumping ahead to the Promise Act Section 3, and I realize that's a little out of order, but it ties with what we were doing here. As part of our program identification, we also asked the institutions to provide us with one additional program of their choosing outside of the 4 fields of study, as the Act said, assuming the additional program is a 2-year associate degree program or a career and technical education certificate or standalone program that corresponds to a high wage, high demand, or critical need occupation. Perfect. And what we realize is that there has been a lot of confusion and differing of opinion regarding what the Promise Act said or intended to say regarding the selection of a program versus a field of study. However, as the Promise Act asks for an additional program, refers to degree requirements, and only programs offer degrees and field of studies do not. And the Kansas Department of Labor only classifies programs as high wage or high demand and does not do the same for fields of study. We will be moving forward with just using an additional program and not field of study in our program approval process at this time. However, and this is a big however, having said that, I want to assure all of the institutions that when or if the Promise Act is revised to account for these issues, we will be back in touch with each and every institution to give you all a chance to select a field of study that you would like to use instead of the individual program which you have currently identified at this time. Please be aware, I also want to mention that please be aware that per the Promise Act, once you designate your additional program or possibly in the future field of study, you will be required to keep it for at least 3 years before you're able to designate a new one. Next slide, please. So where we're at right now in this effort is we've almost finished compiling the comprehensive list of each institution's Promise eligible programs and plan to have the TEA review the programs during their meeting on the 27th of May. Our intent is for the TEA to then make a recommendation to the Board of Regents for final approval during the board's next meeting, which is scheduled for the 16th or 17th of June. Next slide, please. Lastly, I want to make sure that everyone is aware that it is our intent to send each institution a master list of programs that each college is proposing to offer, and we will try to get that out in the next few days. In addition, since new programs come online throughout the year, we also intend to offer institutions the opportunity to request additional Promise Act qualifying programs be added to their qualified list at least twice a year, of course, pursuant to board approval. Once again, I really do appreciate everything that the institutions have done in helping get us where we're at right now, and also for getting back to us in a timely fashion. And with that, I will quit talking and we'll move on to the next slide of our webinar.
Okay, jumping back now to section 2C2. Also because of the short timeline and really more because the institutions already have these local relationships, we are asking the institutions to work with their community partners, such as those listed in the Act under this section here, to publicize Kansas Promise scholarships, including publicizing that you are an eligible institution, publicizing your Promise eligible programs, and publicizing your Promise scholarship application process. Institutions should also make clear that this is a service scholarship that requires the student to live and work in Kansas for 2 years after completion of the Promise eligible program, or after graduation or disenrollment from a Kansas public or private university following the completion of their Kansas eligible program. It is my understanding that the KACCT is working on a common logo or other identifying mark that institutions will be able to use for their promotional materials. And the board office is currently looking at ways to inform high school counselors about the program so that they will be able to let students and their families know that this program is out there for them this year. Next slide.
All right, I think it's back to me. This is Elaine Frisbee again. So now we're on to another section of the bill that outlines Board of Regents responsibilities, still in section 2 of the bill. So the bill requires the State Board of Regents to disperse the funds, which we've talked a little bit about how we're going to go about that. And although we're using that methodology from a clean slate, trying to find a way to distribute this round 1 of funding, year 1 funding for the colleges, that it doesn't mean that you are limited to fund programs in that same manner. So if you had 100 people in one program and 5 people in another eligible program, you spend the resource as needed for eligible programs. So I hope that helps answer that question that's come up. As with so many other things we do, we will have to request data from the participating institutions. And you'll see in this section of the bill that we will submit a report to the legislature every January, and we will be relying on you and your data folks and your financial aid staff to help provide us the information necessary to create this report, which is still an unrealized report, undefined, yet to be determined, but be sure to know that our data folks are thinking about how we're going to go about that. And I think then the next slide gets into section 4. So we already had covered section 3 earlier with Scott, and now we jump to section 4 on slide 16. And Diane Lindeman, our Director of Financial Aid, is going to speak to the amounts of scholarship awards and income eligibility. I would just point out, we have in hand, we have in the bank, if you will, $10 million appropriations for fiscal year 2022 and fiscal year 2023. The legislature went ahead and appropriated $10 million for each year. And as you see in the bill, after that, the appropriation can increase to $15 million in 2024. So within the unified budget process that the Board of Regents uses, they will consider how much to request a year from now for the 2024 budget. We're already about there. So I'm going to turn it over to Diane then to get into the financial aid aspects.
Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Diane Lindeman. I'm the Director of Student Financial Assistance for the Kansas Board of Regents. The House Bill 2064 Section 4 will go over some of the information about eligibility that I'm going to cover in some of the next few slides. So I'd like to just go ahead and move to the next slide. Okay, so this has to do with student eligibility. So I'd like to take just kind of a few minutes to outline some of the basic eligibility, service obligation requirements, and awarding parameters for the Promise scholarships. Students must be a Kansas resident and have graduated from high school or received a high school equivalency or GED within the preceding 12 months of their application for the scholarship. Students can also be 21 years of age or older and be eligible as long as they have been a Kansas resident for the preceding 3 consecutive years. Dependent children of military service members may also be eligible even if their parent was stationed in another state if they have graduated within the preceding 12 months from an out-of-state high school or obtained a high school equivalency or GED. Next slide. Students must complete the required Kansas Promise scholarship application, as well as complete the free application for federal student aid or FAFSA form. They must enroll in an eligible Promise scholarship program at an eligible institution and may enroll either part-time or full-time. Upon acceptance of the scholarship, they must enter into a Promise scholarship service agreement that they agree to work and live in the state of Kansas for 2 consecutive years upon completion of their program of study. They will need to maintain satisfactory academic progress as defined by their school toward the completion of their Promise eligible program. They must complete this program of study within 30 months of the date that they first were awarded the Promise scholarship. Next slide. It will be very important to counsel students receiving this scholarship so that they do realize they have a service obligation to the state of Kansas. So I will repeat this again. They must work in Kansas for a minimum of 2 consecutive years following the completion of their program of study. If students are enrolled in a 2+2 program and will plan to continue their studies at a 4-year public or independent college, they may defer their service obligation until they complete that program of study. Besides service, the obligation may be satisfied if the student commences service in the military after receiving the scholarship, fails to complete their program of study after having made the best effort possible, which will be determined by the Kansas Board of Regents, or are unable to satisfy the requirement due to disability or death of the recipient. Next slide. If the student does not complete their program of study and does not meet any of the criteria mentioned in the previous slide, they would need to repay the scholarship plus accrued interest at the Federal Plus program interest rate within 6 months after failure to satisfy the agreement. At present, the current rate of interest is 5.3%. That will likely change July 1st of 2021. The interest rate would be tied to when the students signed their agreement and will remain at that rate for the time frame that they are enrolled in their program. Installment payments are allowable for repayment. Next slide. The scholarship will be awarded in the amount of aggregate tuition, required fees, books, and required materials, minus all other aid, which would include federal and state grants, scholarships, or financial assistance awards, such as institutional or departmental aid or community scholarships that do not require repayment. So student loans are out of that factor. This is considered a last dollar scholarship. The scholarships are prioritized according to the applicant's annual household income, $100,000 or less for a family of 2, $150,000 or less for a family of 3, and $150,000 plus $4,800 per additional family member beyond 3. If funds remain after awarding the eligible applicants, other students with greater household income may also become eligible. Next slide. For those students who are attending a 4-year eligible post-secondary independent college, the scholarship award is limited to the average cost of what is charged by a 2-year eligible public institution offering the same program. Next slide.
Okay, it's Julene again. This is section 6, and this is the section that speaks to the Kansas Promise Scholarship Agreement that must be entered into between each scholarship recipient and the institution awarding the scholarship. Diane spoke to most of the required agreement terms as she discussed student eligibility for the scholarship, so I won't roll back through those. One that I don't think she mentioned though was there is a requirement that the student recipient of the Promise Scholarship agree to maintain records and report back even after they've completed their Promise eligible program, to document that they are satisfying the residency, employment, and other provisions of the Act. I believe the board office will create a form for the institutions to use to give to the students for that reporting requirement. That's something we haven't gotten to yet. Advance the slide, please. The agreement will also address the requirement for repayment if the student is unable to meet all of the terms of the agreement, including the parameters around repaying in installments and the parameters around any postponement of repayment for good cause. The board office is in the process of drafting this agreement for you to use, and we will have that to you as soon as possible. Next slide, and Elaine.
This section of the bill is simply a very common rendition of related to state budgeting and accounting process. So very much inside baseball. Does not mean much for our scholarship recipients or our institutions, but we will, as Jolene has mentioned, we will have agreements with each of the schools. And in that, we will do our accounting as needed. So you can advance the slide. That's all I'll need to say about that.
Okay, so just to recap our current timeline, several communications have been sent out from this office this month to the institutions, including those that you see on this slide. The feedback from the institutions on the eligible program should be in the board staff's hands now and will be assembled for presentation to the Kansas Post-Secondary Technical Education Authority on May 27th. Which is their next meeting. They will review the list and develop a recommendation to the Board of Regents. And then, as Scott mentioned previously, the board's next opportunity to look at the list and take action would be at its June 16-17 meeting, where it will review the TEA's recommendation and take action to officially identify the Promise eligible programs as is required by the Act. The draft application is now out for feedback. I believe Diane sent those to financial aid officers last week. Board staff will go through the suggested changes and feedback that we get from the institutions and try to provide that final application form to the institutions' financial aid directors by June 1st. In accordance with the Act, students will apply directly to the institution they plan to enroll at and seek the Promise Scholarship Award from. Each institution will take the information provided by the student, either in the application or the FAFSA, to determine the student's eligibility. And then the student will, or the institutions will need to counsel applicants as to what the eligible programs are at that institution, what programs will transfer to specific Kansas public or private institutions, that they must complete a Promise eligible program within 30 months of receiving the award, that within 6 months of graduation from the Promise eligible program, the student must either reside in and commence work in Kansas for at least 2 consecutive years immediately following, or enroll in a Kansas public or private post-secondary institution, and upon graduation or failure to re-enroll in that institution, reside in and commence work in Kansas for at least 2 consecutive years immediately following. The application deadline for this initial year, we think that it's best to just set a priority deadline. We're thinking that should be October 1st. What that means is that institutions can still accept applications after that date, but you're attempting to get as many in before then as possible. It would also enable the award of scholarships for the spring 2022 semester. So you'll be keeping track of how far that your portion of that $10 million will go in this first year. Students need to have an appeal, or institutions, I'm sorry, need to have an appeal process for any student whose application is denied or whose scholarship is revoked. A draft of the service scholarship agreement will be sent out by June 1st. Again, the agreement, the funds disbursement agreement and the service scholarship agreement, those will contain a lot of these requirements. So you won't be starting from scratch on trying to develop what that's going to look like. We'll provide the agreement form to the institutions in an electronic format so that then they can either have students sign electronically or they can print the form for wet signatures if that's how they do business, however they choose to do that. Institutions will need to enter this agreement with each student they deem eligible for a promised scholarship through the application process. And the service agreement form provided by the board office will contain all the act required obligations. Institutions will need to insert their name, contact information, and signature block. It's going to be sort of a form agreement so that any institution could use it. A draft of the funds disbursement agreement between the board office and each eligible institution will be sent out for review by June 1st again. July 1st, as Elaine mentioned, is the actual date the act takes effect. And the board office, it sounded like maybe we've already received the appropriation. I thought that happened after July 1st. I'm not sure now. Within 10 business days of receiving the appropriation and after receipt of the institution's signed funds disbursement agreement, promised scholarship funds will be dispersed to each eligible institution having eligible programs. And as I mentioned earlier, the deadline for having regulations for this program isn't until March 1st, 2022. We'll work to meet that deadline, enlisting institutional feedback as we go. So we know that there are key elements still needed to be worked out, and we will keep you updated as we gather that information. We hope you've made use of the QA option. I see several people have during the webinar. Our plan is to use the questions and comments that you have submitted today to begin building an FAQ that we will both post on our website and forward to the institutions. If you were not able to submit a question that you had today, or if you think of a question later, you may email those. We ask you to email them to promise@ksbor.org. I think if you'll advance the slide again, I got ahead of you, I'm sorry. It's here on this screen. To help us ensure that we're capturing all the questions and can provide answers in the most efficient way possible. After the webinar closes, please use this dedicated email address. That's basically all we have for you today. Thank you for your time and attention. We'll work to continue providing information on this program as we continue to develop it. And I will say that this webinar has been recorded and it will be available on our website for anyone who was unable to attend today, or for those of you who just want to hear it again or spend more time with it later. Thank you all very much for joining us.